Hello everyone, I am Denita Magdalene. I am a postgraduate student from the Faculty of Planning at CEPT University. My research focuses on decoding the dynamics of urban resilience of Bapunagar. Through this video, I will be covering this topic in 5 parts. The resilience of a city is dependent on two variables, that is, urban sociology and the metabolism of the systems involved. The study area Bapunagar is located in the eastern part of the older city of Ahmedabad, and it consists of two types of settlements, the formal and the informal settlements. The urban resilience of Bapunagar can be broken down into two parts, the urban sociology and the metabolism of the systems involved. The urban sociology includes the necessary system, the resultant system, and the social system. The necessary system includes all the growth determinants that instigated the development of any physical infrastructure. This will in turn result in the people migrating to that space and also in the resultant infrastructure. This in turn will influence the other factors involved which affects the social sustainability, the system and the interactions involved. All this can be influenced by the metabolism, which is the interactions happening between the spaces created and the people involved throughout the transformation of the space. But how did Bapunagar's present urban sociology structure come to be? History has shown that the entire area in fact has had the capacity to adapt and transform according to any challenges which has been rising over the decades. For example, in the 1800s, the entire area was an agricultural area where all the household sizes were so small and every settlement came under the formal settlement category. When it transitioned into the 1950s, the growth of the mills allowed the area to see even informal settlements, which changed the size of the households as well, therefore leading to decreasing per capita space as well. But then in the 1990s, the decline of the mills transformed the entire area. More and more different types of commercial spaces had to come up because people needed income. So then the entire per capita space of the person also changed. The type of housing also changed. The type of settlement also changed. The entire nature changed. And even now, this system is still changing. This shows that there has been multiple trade-offs happening between the communities, such as the informal and the formal communities throughout the decades, and those kinds of trade-offs are also happening in the necessary resultant and social systems, and it is not uniform throughout the years as well. As you can see in the graph, in certain cases the resultant system trade-offs has been more, especially during the 1990s. But this does not limit to the community trade-offs alone. It also leads to micro trade-off across communities. The type of job opportunities has been changing from agriculture to mills to small scale industries as well. And because of this, the education system within the families has also changed. When people had to give up their jobs, the children had also had to quit their jobs, quit their education, and also transform into the home based economy system as well. So thus, as the economy has been rising and going down as well, still the community is thriving till now, which shows that despite the unstable economy, the urban resilience has been growing in Bapunagar. So, how has this resulted in the development of the resultant system of Bapunagar? So, the studies showed that 48% of the entire area comes under open spaces, yet 14% of it comes under the road area. So, what is their nature then? So when we looked at the hierarchy and connectivity of the roads as well, we were able to see that 50% of it came under the collector roads and 18% came under the local roads. And there were so many dead ends as well. When we looked at the walkability, we could see that predominantly it was highest block perimeters. So it was clearly not walkable or accessible in the smaller parts. This is this is also reflective of the huge housing societies which make up the entire coarse grain and fine grain settlements also in this area. So this also affects the walkability audit as well. So because of this huge chunks of land, when we look at a pedestrian's walkability experience, only 3.4% of it comes under a very good walkability space where the two sides of the street are shaded and people have proper pavements to walk on. As Kevin Lynch rightly said, each city has its own parts, nodes, landmarks, edges, and districts that influence the city. This shows that because of the large block perimeters and the poor walkability audit scores, it shows that predominantly it's all very introverted communities and it's not very pedestrian oriented as well. Thus, the street hierarchy has also kind of influenced the nodes and the built up spaces as well. So, what is their nature then? So, when we see at the built up space, so as we discussed before, 48% is open space, but in the remaining percentage, you can see that majority in 100% of the built up, 83% of it comes under residential and only 13.7 comes under commercial. If so, then what is the kind of residential settlements happening? So then I try to decode it in terms of how are the formal and informal settlements happening? Are they very highly dense? Or in other terms, are they equitably distributed? Through the study showed that the maximum share is by the formal settlements and also they had a better living standards compared to the informal settlements. Though it shows that 89.5% of the people come under the formal settlement character. Furthermore, decoding of the anatomy of urban density through floor space occupancy, FSI, and residential shares showed that there is high density in both formal and informal settlements. It's just that the formal settlements were living a little better off compared to the informal settlements. Thus, the higher FSI doesn't necessarily lead to higher floor space occupancy in both cases. When we look at the plot coverage versus population, in huge societies, the houses were taking so much of space when compared to the informal settlements with people who were living with lesser per capita space. So the hypothesis was maximum coverage, higher population, lesser coverage, low to mid-sized population. But as you can clearly see, even though the houses are huge, the number of people living in that huge space also is very large. For example, in a two-story semi-detached unit which has four living units, the population per hectare shows that it is 153.1, whereas in an apartment which is only 5 stories and has 8 units, the population per hectare rises to 749.1. Even though the plot coverage keeps reducing, the population per hectare rises because of the FSI. So this creates another hypothesis such as FSI versus population. So lower FSI doesn't in this case reflects higher population. Higher FSI leads to lower or mid-sized population, but this also changes according to the space. In certain higher income group areas, higher FSI leads to lesser population, but in a densely packed area like Bapunagar, the entire hypothesis is broken and also higher FSI here means more population as well. Even then, the area permits for more FSI in this area. So even then, people are still living in a very low-rise buildings. This is because the existing FSI is being used for commercial purposes as well. For example, in a semi-detached unit over here, we can see that the brown shaded spaces are the residential spaces, whereas the greener shade ones are the commercial spaces. You can see that there's a clear, distinct segregation in the spaces, and also half the FSI, nearly half the FSI is being used for commercial spaces as well. So this also influences the per capita floor space used by an individual as well. We cannot calculate the entire house area under the per capita floor space because there are also people doing home businesses, so their home also becomes a commercial space. So their home itself, the nature of their home keeps changing, which changes the nature of the residential built up and every other factor related to it. But also these factors also make us understand that there is no equitable distribution of dwelling spaces, and that has led to spatial injustice in Bapunagar. So why aren't the informal settlements moving to an affordable housing schemes where there's so many schemes being implemented? The first reason is that because there's a demand and supply gap. For example, 691 slum settlements are there. Only 1.62 lakh houses are there, and there's a housing shortage of more than 1 lakh households. How can this demand be met when 13.1% of entire Ahmedabad is actually informal settlements? And this is also reflective of the census taken in 2011 alone. But even then, how are the formal settlements living? They are also living in dilapidated or congested or even inadequate housing only. But then, how can we bridge this gap? So, there's an increase in inadequate housing as the years go by, and there's also an increase in informal settlements, which is affecting the state's growth and the market value also. But still, we all know this. Then, why is it not being done? The first is because there's limited from funding from the state and central government, and even though there are town planning valuation schemes also being proposed and also tried to be implemented across the years, when it's being implemented, because of the growing population, these allotted lands are being used for, or let me rephrase it, as being appropriated for public infrastructure by the AMC itself, that is the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, or even sold to private investors for higher market value, because these areas are also located in a transit oriented corridor. So then what could be done? We could implement a PPP model where the private developers have the investor 40%, and also we can reduce the burden on the government as well and formulate a better cash flow funding scheme. So how can this be done? Let me break it down into 6 steps. So the first step is the inception of the SEWS housing on allocated plots, that is through the TPVD schemes, and finding a solution to the funding problem is through the PPP model, as which is commonly done in the in situ slum rehabilitation program. The second step is, let's construct the SEWS and the private housing using grants and debt finances as well, and also allocate the spaces. Not necessarily everything should come under the SEWS housing scheme inside the plot. A part of it can also be used for financial purposes for the government to get money also. The allocation of SEWS housing also can happen through a lottery system, whereas we can allocate through how much average annual income a household is receiving, and we can segregate them into EWS and LIG and then allot the house, so that the people who are most in need have the first come first serve priority basis. Now when we split the ratio like 60 to 40% or 70 to 30%, we can get revenue generation from the same land itself. Thus more stakeholders are also involved, and also cost recovery and profit also happens simultaneously. This will result in a better relationship between the state and people. When we look at the quality and access of infrastructure in the area, so let's look at the first part, the waste management. So this comes under the resultant system. But the resultant system itself can be broken down into three parts: the individual system, social system, and the environmental system. So the individual system includes the behavior and activities of the individuals involved in the entire waste management system. The social system includes the quality of life and interactions influenced by this current system. The environmental system is the resultant or the most affected system because of the individual and social system, which will in turn affect the related systems as well. Right now, because of the behavior of the individuals, there is a gap between the individual system and the social system, which is raising a need for an efficient waste management system. But what if we change at the household level? There are various interventions for garbage collection systems happening at the major landfill at Pirana site in Ahmedabad. But if we change at the household level, everything gets better. Right from the individual system at the household, your immediate space is cleaner because you segregate the waste, and there are smaller collection points which goes to a larger collection point. So you break down the collection point system as well, which will also lead to a better environmental system as well, because once people collect it from the households, and when they go to the dry waste area, also segregated dry waste area and segregated wet waste area, where people segregate the waste at a larger scale and also sell it for revenue generation as well. So the people involved, that is the garbage cleaners, also have a better health because the waste are clearly segregated and they don't have to interact with the toxic waste as well. Right now, when we look at the garbage cleaner system in a daily basis, they start from the Naroda parking, which is 4.9 kilometers away from the collection point, and then they take up their trucks and go travel for 2.5 kilometers, collecting all the waste from the households, and then take it to a refuse station which is 3.1 kilometers away. And over there, they weigh the total weight. They again segregate it because not every household segregates it. And then they again go back to the rest of the households where they need to collect and come back. And this process gets repeated every day. And this is such a tedious process and a very unhygienic and unsafe environment for the garbage cleaners. But when you change at the household level, it creates a better system for the garbage cleaners and the garbage creators as well. When we look at the water management, so in terms, because this is a predominantly residential area, this residential water supply is clearly taken by semi-detached housing typologies, and also they need 10.5 million liters per day because it's a residential area. When we look at the topography and catch pits, you can see that the altitude changes a little bit and there are larger water logging spots also towards the south area. Now, how has all these resultant systems affected the necessary system structure as well? Now, when we look at it, especially through the jobs, the nature of jobs, as I said before, the nature of jobs keeps changing over here. So right now it is 47% self-employed, which is a part of their residence. A 2% is home businesses. 17% is casual jobs. Casual jobs includes daily wage jobs or coolie jobs or even auto rickshaw jobs where their income is not stable. So this affects the mode of transportation which an individual takes also. So because majority of it is home based or self-employed, people prefer to take private transport because it is more under their control, and also people also use non-motorized transport such as cycles to just get their raw materials from nearby as well. So how has this entire internal system affected the metabolism outside of Bapunagar? Because people just don't stay within Bapunagar. Obviously, they travel outside for education and maybe better job opportunities as well. So when we look at it, there are people who travel more than 10 kilometers away from Bapunagar, and when we look at their cases, it is only because their literacy rate is high that people travel so far. So this shows that as the literacy rate increases, people travel far for better jobs and better salary, which also influences the type of transportation they take, which also influences the nature or the type of households which they lead. Now, even then, when we look at it, the public transportation is very less. As you can see, it is just 2.8% and 1.4% when we look at it as male and female ratios. So why is it so less? Because there's a lack of connection to public transportation, because in this particular area majority of the people are staying within Bapunagar. So there hasn't been that much development of public transportation. So thus lack of connection to public transportation has led to higher waiting time, higher percentage of multimodal transport, which has led to higher percentage of income itself spent on transportation itself. Thus, when we look at an affordability lens, not everyone is living in an affordable status. Predominantly, people are living in non-affordable area only because their savings are also very less. You can see that the other expenses and mainly the transportation expense in certain cases take 53% of the people's household income. This is also reflective of their average per capita floor space. Just because they're living in an affordable area doesn't mean, or they have more savings doesn't mean they have better per capita floor space. You can see that almost every type of housing, apartment, semi-detached, detached, or even slum, have the same, almost the same per capita floor space. But even then, when we look at the ownership, only 25% of the entire residential built up is being owned by themselves, which means that 75% people who come under the rented category spend so much of their income on transportation and household itself. Thus, even though urban resilience is very high, the livability conditions is deteriorating and the income is also low. Yet people prefer to stay here. This is because the influence of the social system throughout the years has led to this kind of a nature. Now, as we discussed before, 34% of the open space, which is excluding the 14% road area. So the 34% open space, only 0.2% comes under public spaces. So what happens to the remaining open spaces? As I said before, these are formed by larger housing societies. So those housing societies have their own private open spaces, which includes the building margin areas as well. So when we look at an arterial street, for example, only the edges are active public zones. And this is also because of the openness of the building's margin areas. So this is leading to the activities just spilling out onto the road. This is also influenced by the ground floor usage of the buildings. If the ground floor usage is commercial, the ground floor margin area also gets activated. If it's a closed off activity like a hospital or even a residential area, the ground floor will not be that active. So these kind of spaces has resulted in social activities such as passive contacts and also formal conversations happening across the streets itself. And there are various physical elements across the streets which influence the nature of activities. For example, a compound wall. The lack of a compound wall allows for an visual interaction which can also lead to a formal and informal interaction. The presence of a street light can lead to a safer zone for even women to interact, can also give up the confidence a woman needs to cross the road or even come to that street. The accessibility of a margin space which also allows for visual connectivity, all these factors has allowed the street to be appropriated for different kinds of public spaces, right from the arterial, subarterial collector to the local streets. When we look at the subarterial streets, you can see that there's a mix of building usage and which has led to a mix of activities such as the resultant and necessary activities as well. So you can see that the road area keeps shrinking when it goes to the collector's streets as well. You can see the public spaces ratio is increasing and the road area is increasing. So the road becomes more of a shared space for vehicles and people, even though the streets were not designed for it that way. As we saw before, the walkability audit score doesn't show that most of the streets are very good to walk on. This shows that people keep appropriating themselves. So what does this mean for Bapunagar's future? So there's a development of a transit-oriented corridor happening right across Bapunagar, which is resulting in an increased FSI of 4.0. This will lead to more public transportation access, but also, even though the development has started happening, the FSI changes are still not yet reflected over here. So, which means there are three characters: old buildings which are already over here, there's also an FSI increase, and there's also the growing population in this area who are not going to leave anytime soon. So, what does this mean for Bapunagar's future? This could result in the redevelopment of the entire Bapunagar area. Thank you for listening to this presentation.